Early in the 1700s, there were black slaves in Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. These black slaves, a lot of them who wanted to escape from the misery of slavery, they escaped over into Spanish Florida. And a lot of these black people who escaped lived in the swamps such as the Okefenokee Swamp of Georgia and southern Florida. So what happened was these blacks that escaped over into Florida, the people gave them the name Maroons. And after a while, of course, a lot of people don't know that Spain owned Florida. And at one time, the Spanish government felt that the United States of America was going to take it from them because they couldn't get supplies, they couldn't get men here because they were at war with France. France. So what happened, the Spanish government sent out a word that any Native American from Georgia, Alabama, wherever, want to come over into Spanish Florida, they were welcome to come over. Any black slave in Georgia, Alabama, or South Carolina who wanted to come over into Spanish Florida, abide by the rules and regulations, even if they wanted to convert to Catholicism, it was all well and fine. But in Alabama and Georgia, there was a group of Native Americans. They called them Creek Indians. The reason they called them Creek Indians is because there were so many family groups, so many different groups that were spread out throughout the territory. They said, well, we can't remember all of these different group names, so we just call them all Creek Indians. So the Creek Indians that came over into Spanish Florida, they gave them the name Seminoles, meaning wild people or runaway. And the name ended up Seminole. So the word Seminole means runaway or wild people. So those people that we call Seminoles, the Spanish government gave them land to live on, gave them the state-of-the-art weapons, because they needed allies to help hold on to Spanish Florida. But the slaves that had got the message that if you can make it to Spanish Florida, there's a chance you can be free, that's when they started coming over into Florida. We had people from Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. Of course, the people that came from South Carolina, today we call them Gullah Geechee people. And these people, we call Gullah Geechee people, came in and settled with the Seminole Indians. The Seminoles made a deal with the black people that they came in contact with. They said, well, we all got a common enemy. We all know that sooner or later, the land that we have, they're going to try to take from us. So the blacks that came to the Seminoles said, well, there are other Indian groups that have slaves. The Creek Indians have slaves. And most of all, there was a tribe of Indians called Cherokees. So the Seminoles say, well, we don't have no interest really to be in the slave business. So they made a deal with the black people. They told the black people, say, well, we know you got agricultural skills. Some of you got skills in building houses and every other thing that you might need. They also say, well, you know how to speak English. Some of you know how to speak English. Some of you know how to speak Spanish. They say, well, you've been around white people all your lives. You know how they act. You know how they react. So what you do, come and live with us, live on our land, and when the slave owners or slave catchers come at you, we'll tell them you belong to us, and we'll protect you. We'll tell them that they can't have you because you're our friends and allies. So that's what happened. Runaway slaves coming from Georgia and Alabama and Carolina. Some live near the Seminoles within their villages. A lot of them live far away. I figure the reason they wanted to live far away is because they had their own Christian practices. They have their own Afrocentric culture they wanted to keep, so they wanted to stay to themselves. But when the slave owners and slave catchers wanted to come after their slaves, the Seminoles say, no, you can't have them. They belong to us. And when the slaves and the Seminoles start raiding plantations to get other slaves and start burning crops, start burning buildings and killing white people, that's when it hit the fan. She got horns. I don't want her to mistaken hit me with horns. So that's when the Seminole Wars began, when they started killing white people and burning crops, because agriculture was a big thing for the people in the South. And when they started doing that, then that's when they got the military involved. The military got involved, and their main purpose was to catch all the slaves, send them back to the slave plantation, and get all the Indians out of the area, because the white people wanted to settle the area that they had here in Florida. The Seminoles had here in Florida. So that's basic history there. Now I can talk about some other things, but all of this information is online.
Well, that's what I want. Can you give us something that we don't hear about all the time?
The Black Seminoles.
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you about my family.
Okay.
My great-granddaddy was a black man who lived in Lower Peachtree, Alabama. He undoubtedly lived with the Indians there at some time or point in his life. What he did, him and his wife and kids, he dressed up as a woman, and him and his wife and kids left Alabama and came down here in Central Florida to a place we call Hernando County. It's near a place called Brooksville. He came down and they lived with the Indians. And we wonder why would he leave Alabama and come to Florida instead of trying to go north. What it was, there was a group of Creek Indians had come down from Alabama and settled in Central Florida, Hernando County, and these people was called Eufaulers. And the Eufaula people settled there, and actually I've been to sites where they settled. Is similar to Alabama. You got clay hills and valleys, and so when he came down and brought his kids, my mom's granddaddy, he married a Seminole woman. He took her from a village called Chocochatty. Chocochatty means red town or red house. He took her to his farm, and that's where he had children by her. So that's where my Seminole bloodline come from. My great-great-grandmother, her name was Sally Sinclair, and his name was Hampton Sinclair. Now, it's a peculiar thing about a lot of people didn't get a chance to see her because he was one black man nobody wanted to tangle with. And you had some terrible times back then where even in that area, black people would be being lynched, all kind of atrocities performed against them. But he was the kind of man, black people didn't tangle with him, white people didn't tangle with him, nobody tangled with him. So he didn't allow nobody up on his property. So a lot of people didn't even get to see her, and she wouldn't allow nobody to take her photograph. Of course, a lot of Native Americans back then didn't want you to take the photograph because they felt you captured their spirit, and you got their spirit in your hand. But believe it or not, when she died, they buried her under the house. And we took a long time to figure out what was happening with that. The Creek Indians and some Seminoles, when they bury one of their people, they will build a little house type thing on top of the grave. Now if you go to Oklahoma to the Seminole reservations and their cemeteries, they build pretty good sized houses on top of the grave. So she must have gave them instructions, I want to be buried under a house. And they literally buried her under the house. And the homestead that was built in 1889 is still there. And some of the artifacts that my great-great-granddad had, he was what they call a medicine man. And my cousin still got some of the spoons and jars that he would mix up portions to heal different things. And he would chant different things to heal people spiritually. My mom never did talk about him because my brother told me that she was scared of those kind of people. And of course, you know, in black culture, they call those people root people. But in those days, black people couldn't go to the drugstore, and a lot of times doctors wouldn't even come into where a black settlement was because they didn't figure it was important. But black people had to figure out a way to heal themselves physically and also in a spiritual way. But of course, my granddaddy Hampton St. Clair, he ended up being the first pastor of the first black Baptist church in the community. So that's where my side of the family, Seminole side, came from. Now my dad on the other side, he came from Georgia. He came from a place called Sylvania, Georgia, Scriven County, and he said he had Native American blood. He told my brother that he had Apache blood, but he left home as a young boy, and the probability he either was saying Yuchi or Appalachia. And historically, there was a lot of black people intermarried with Native American people because they did, as I said previously, they had a common enemy, and they did have that spiritual sense that they had some kind of kinship together. But during that time, the white people kept the Indians and the blacks apart because once they came together, they were a formidable foe. And they wanted to keep blacks in slavery, and they wanted to keep the Indians, those they didn't have in slavery, they wanted to keep them apart from the blacks. So basically, when you talk about black Seminoles, you're talking about black people in the early 1800s who came to live with the Seminoles out of the thought of they could be free. But if you Google in the black Seminoles, there's all kind of books on the subject. If you go to the images, you'll see pictures of me and my family. There's a lot of information. Matter of fact, I just came back from out in Texas in September, where a number of black people left here with Seminole people, and they were sent to Oklahoma. And when they got to Oklahoma, they were afraid that the slave catchers were going to catch them and send them back south. They left with a Native American chief called Kawakachi, and his name interpreted is Wildcat. They left along with a black man named John Horse, who was the interpreter and war leader, and they went all the way into Mexico. They had gotten word that the Mexican government had abolished slavery, so they went all the way to Mexico. And the Mexican government hired them as border guards because there was a raiding Apaches, there was raiding Comanches, Comancheros, Banditos, and outlaws going back and forth across the border into Mexico and back into Texas. So the Mexican government hired these men because they were good trackers and they were men that knew how to fight using all type of weaponry. So they stayed there for a number of years, but when they came back over into the United States government gave them basically the same job of protecting their borders. And they called these men Black Seminole Scouts. And when I went out in Texas, some of the descendants of those people, they have a parade every year commemorating the Black Seminole Scouts. On that Saturday and Sunday, they would go to the cemetery because they had men there buried there who won, 4 of them won the Congressional Medal of Honor as Black Seminole Scouts. And eventually, a lot of those men end up with a group called the Buffalo Soldiers. And but the history is alive. The history can't be refuted. I don't care whether you're Native American, white, or black. You can't refute that black people did want to fight for their freedom, and they would go to any extent to keep themselves free, militarily, diplomatically, whatever. They wanted to be free. And but like I said, a lot of people don't know about this. The reason a lot of things is not known about black people, when you talk about cowboys and Indians, when you talk about cavalry, when you talk about men who have been portrayed as heroes, we were left out. When you talk about cowboys, when I was growing up, I thought all the cowboys was white men. I thought all the cavalry men was white men. When I found out that 10% of the black men out west, they worked as cowboys. And the name cowboy was given to the black men. If you call a white man a cowboy back in those days, you had a fight on your hand. Because the black man never was a man, he always was a boy who worked the cows. But what happened when the novelists start making heroes out of men called cowboys, they left the black man out. When they started writing novels and books, then later on they started making movies, they left the black man out. Simply because they didn't want to show the black man in the light of being a hero. They didn't want to show him in the light as a man who had nerve to fight. Even when you talk about in the old days going to the movies where you always heard the cavalry coming, you heard the bugle blowing, and it was always the valiant white guys coming to save the settlers. But they don't tell you about the 9th and 10th Cavalry, all black men called Buffalo Soldiers. They don't tell you about that, who saved a lot of lives out on the American frontier, fighting the Indians to save the settlers. And we were involved not only from that time on up to modern day time, where black men gave their lives and had the nerves and fortitude to fight for this country. Believe it or not, the first man to die in the American Revolution was a black man called Crispus Attucks. From Crispus Attucks all the way to Afghanistan, Pakistan, we've been fighting for this country and our freedom since then. Even in modern day times, the word never had gotten out till movies was made about the Tuskegee Airmen. It was said a black man didn't have the mentality to fly airplanes. There were tank groups that black men were in. They say they didn't have the mentality to drive a tank. This whole thing about black men and the stereotypical thing that they showed in the old movies about Mantan, Molan, and number of stars, when you say boo, their eyes got big and they took off running. All of that was created to put in the mind that black people didn't have any nerve. They don't tell you about the African warriors. They don't tell you about, even coming up in modern day times, that the Zulus almost conquered them. If they'd had the technology and the weaponry, they would have conquered them. But it's all something to deny black people as being human beings. Black people human beings that want to raise their families in comfort and in peace. There was a black man not far from where I am. He had a village, and it was called Palaklakaha. Palaklakaha means many ponds. I've been on archaeological digs there with Dr. Terrence White when he was at the University of Florida. Abraham was the interpreter for a chief named Micanopy. Abraham was called the cense bearer. Abraham, he was the man that talked to the white officials on behalf of Micanopy. The reason they called him a cense bearer because he could make sense out of what the white man was saying. He could make sense out of what the Indian was saying. And this man was smart enough and had enough mental capacity to always, when he talked with white people, to make sure the better end of it was for his own black people. He was called Negro Abraham, and he escaped from slavery from a family, I think Dr. Sierra family, and he escaped to the Native Americans we call Seminoles. He could speak their language. It was probably Muskogee Creek that he learned to speak. He could have learned how to speak Miccosukee or Hitchiti, but he was very famous in negotiating with white people on the behalf of the Seminole Indians and their black allies.
I have a question. The descendants of the Seminoles, what are they doing in Florida? What is their position in Florida today, those descendants?
The descendants in Florida, there's a few people know their heritage. Even today, the Seminole tribe of Florida got 5 or 6 reservations here. And the one that's predominantly black is the reservation in a place called Fort Pierce. Like I said earlier, this history about the blacks and their participation in the Seminole Wars, really, if you're not a history major, anthropology, or archaeology professor, attaining to be a professor, sometime in your educational process, you don't even come in contact with it. There's a lot of black people got Native American blood, but white people set up a stereotype that you got to look like a Native American. You got to have a high cheekbone, you got to have the broad hook nose, and you got to have straight hair. That don't always work. Coffee washes out milk a lot of times, but it's still coffee. And what I'm saying, I've been on the reservation with little light-skinned boys who look Indian. Their hair was in a big afro and just as naughty as any other black person. I've seen the little black one, dark-skinned one, have hair all the way down the shoulder. So which one look like an Indian? It's whatever people set up what the Indian's supposed to look like. All the Indians don't look alike. The Seminoles don't look like Apaches. The Seminoles don't look like Mohawks. As sure as all Indians don't look alike, all black people don't look alike. So this stereotypical thing about having the thin lips and all of this, that's a bunch of crap. Okay?